Welcome to the Conditional Release Program, a podcast that delves into the netherworld of cults, crims and con artists. We don't like these people and it shows. We believe the best way to expose them is to hold them up to a harsh light, point our index fingers in their general direction and mock them mercilessly, take them down a peg or two until they cease to exist in any other form than the shit on our shoes. I'm Jack the Insider, otherwise known as Peter Hoisted for tax purposes.
And I'm Joel Hill, and today we're going to take you to the extremes of ideology. Turn at the centre, take a hard right, and keep driving until you see a bunch of potato-headed jackboot thugs staring you right in the eye.
They don't look good in their uniforms. In fact, they don't wear them anymore. Too obvious. The days of the Australian Nazi Party walking around the streets in their brown shirts and swastikas are over.
Nah, there's not a Reichsadler or a Totenkopf, I think I said that right, to be seen either. They don't even rock the red suspenders anymore, and they really fucked up the rude boy thing for the Scar kids on that one. Doc Marten sales figures have plummeted since the golden days of 80s Nazis. But your latter-day Nazi or neo-Nazi keeps a paraphernalia locked up in the shed, and probably wisely too, because the Nazis have had a bit of a PR problem over the past 70-odd years.
Well, that's why they prefer to call themselves patriots or nationalists, the two being mutually exclusive, by the way. They recruit their members by appealing to the scourge of all argument, patriotism.
You'd think after World War II, where, 80 million people died, including an industrial-scale genocide that saw 6 million Jews killed, that would have been the end of Nazism as we know it. But here we are, 75 years later, dealing with this bullshit again.
It's hard to crack gags about Nazis. They are not fun people, but there are a lot of myths perpetuated about them, and we're going to debunk them. We're also going to set our sights on the rise of Nazism in Australia, who they are, where they are now, and what threat they pose.
See, we've ignored them for a while in the hope they would just simply fuck off into obscurity, but they just keep popping up. And now that Pete's got his army of Q-pilled wellness acolytes looking into the real history of Germany, I reckon it's only going to get worse. The time for complacency is over, and we'll cover this in our deeper dive.
But now it's time to look at the unfolding, incomprehensible madness around the world in our weekly news. Now, speaking of Nazis, Joel, one of their ilk, Phillip Galea, was hurled into a slammer with the door firmly shut behind him for at least 9 years and hopefully the full 12 for planning terrorist attacks in Melbourne.
Yeah, our mate Galea had been associated with the lovely right-wing dickhead groups such as the True Blue Crew and Reclaim Australia, which is a fringe political party full of utter bastards, which pointlessly ran candidates in parts of Australia in the 2016 federal election and got about as many votes as they deserved.
Now, this grossly obese hirsute scumbag had been on police radar for some time, having been previously arrested for possessing bomb-making equipment. He's been all over far-right groups, all of whom quickly discarded him, but only after he was charged with terrorist offences.
He'd planned attacks on the Trades Hall Council and the Socialist Alliance HQ, the Resistance Centre, which is in inner-city Melbourne. But what was interesting and deeply ironic is that he learned bomb-making from one of the groups he despised so much, the anarchists, which means, to be honest, he was probably not very good at it. He plagiarised large chunks of the anarchist cookbook and cobbled it together, came up with the Patriots cookbook in a bid to get other Australian Nazis to launch further attacks. Because there's nothing like a good rebrand, Jack.
Indeed. It's probably only his brutish stupidity that prevented further targets from being identified and more attacks planned. And this is what we'll be talking about in a deeper dive, Joel. The threat these people pose is enormous here and around the world. Until then, it's bye-bye, Phillip Galea. See you later, you Nazi cunt. Enjoy your holiday. It's going to be a long one.
And to keep the Nazi theme rolling along, the man behind the Conditional Release program's most popular segment, The Week in Pete Evans, was shown the door by almost all of his commercial partners after posting a cartoon which showed a neo-Nazi symbol, the Black Sun or the Sonorad, which had been sported on the backpack of mass murderer and giant fuckwit Brenton Tarrant. And before you knew it, the sponsors dropped Pete Evans like a hot bratwurst.
Indeed they did. We had been set to watch Pete's dial back on television and on the appalling I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, but Network 10 swiftly gave him the arse even while Pete was in quarantine for the show. Pam McMillan, Woolies, Coles all gave him the flick. Even his pet food, Bob, that I didn't even know was a thing, Pete Evans Paleo Pal or something, They sent him packing.
Yeah, the final indignity was actually doTERRA, the MLM company, knocking out Pete's essential oils, flicking Pete's lovely gear from the catalogue of their fine, overpriced products. Although it looks like they might have backtracked recently after underestimating how many Nazis seem to like essential oils.
It does beg the question, Joel. After a huge week, possibly Paleo Pete's biggest week ever, will there ever be another week in Pete Evans' segment for our devoted listeners to snigger at? Has the great man been silenced?
Not a chance, Jack. We've had commercially bound Pete, and while that is still a wild ride, don't get me wrong, it is a Disney film compared to what Nothing to Lose Pete's going to offer, because he's been holding back. He has been held back, and now, bless him, he can tell us what he really thinks.
He's been unchained. Saints be praised, Joel. But look, all this talk about Nazis is thirsty work. So what's the go with the whole great reset from last week?
Yeah, bloody Pauline's nonsense. So I've been getting very deep into the Great Reset this week, and I'm really trying to nut it out. As a political economy guy, I find this shit very interesting. But you guys, maybe not so much.
Economics.
It's definitely the next hot topic when it comes to these usual fuckwits who have, let's face it, already been posting about it on their Telegram, because you can guess who I'm alluding to here. So the Great Reset is basic. It's not a new concept, but it is one whose time has come in the post-COVID era, well, COVID era. And in summary, a bunch of economists think that capitalism is basically ready to shit the bed at any time due to shocks like COVID, and needs a bit of an overhaul. Now, I could spend an hour on this, and I probably will in a video later. We have a YouTube channel. Here's the funny bit. See, the World Economic Forum has been circulating a document which is either one of the worst pieces of political communication I've ever seen, or it's intentionally trying to bait right-wing groups into having a genuine meltdown.
Now, the World Economic Forum, Joel. I remember Davos. Some of the wealthiest hand-wringers in the world got about and bounced a few ideas around, which virtually meant them holding onto all their money while distributing someone else's.
Yeah, not much has changed, Jack. The title of the article, which they're placing in publications as a sponsored piece, just so you know, is called Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better. I mean, that's the actual fucking title of the actual article. So the usual suspects like Rowan Dean and the Sky News After Dark vampire types have been frothing at the mouth over this. And Pauline, not known for doing her own research or any research whatsoever, has bought the dumb fuck angle, hook, line, and sinker, and probably a little bit of YouTube and BitChute on the side.
Oh, sure, she's on the vids. Yeah, she's on the vids for sure, Joel, yes.
Oh, of course she is, mate. She's OG. You know, she does her own research, according to internet dumbassery. So the article says in itself that the future, we won't own things as much as share them. Utilities that we currently have as a market-driven commodity will be treated more like essentials. Housing, things like this, more free of charge. And there's a lot to be said there, but as a millennial that owns fuck all besides a computer and a car, this kind of appeals to me. I mean, boomers, however, are shitting themselves. They think that the WEF are coming for all their investment properties and everything's going to become some sort of state-owned property. They're not, though, so calm down. The thing that really underpins this, though, is the so-called giant hoax that is climate change. Now, climate change is, in reality, set to decimate the world as we know it. But, as usual, the right are intellectual nobodies and emotional cowards who choose to pretend that it's not happening. Like a child putting their fingers in their ears and going, la, 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 la. So naturally, anything that seeks to stop us from turning into a plague-ridden tinderbox really pisses them off.
Wait a minute. Hold up there just a minute. The tagline for this is, we'll all own nothing and we'll all be happy. And this sounds like a WEF special, another fucking motherhood statement that will not happen, cannot happen, and won't even be contemplated for more than a millisecond by anyone who isn't an aging singer in a rock band. Did they seriously think that was a good line? I mean, what the fuck?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's almost like bait. And it doesn't actually make any sense, but if you look into it further, it makes more sense on a very meta, stupid level. But we've got more. This is another direct quote from this article, this gold mine of bad communication.
Give it to me, Joe.
My biggest concern is all the people who do not live in our city those we lost along the way, those who decided that it became too much, all this technology, those who felt obsolete and useless when robots and AI took over parts of our jobs, those who got upset with the political system and turned against it. They live different kinds of lives now outside of the city. Some have formed little self-supplying communities. Others just stayed in the empty and abandoned houses in small 19th century villages. So basically what they just did is they enabled all the paranoia from Pete Evans types and put it in a narrative that sounds like Dennis Leary's character from Demolition Man.
I remember it. I do remember it. Yeah, Sliced Alone, and was the other lad in it?
Wesley Snipes. The tax
Wesley
evade.
Snipes doing his own stunts until someone else had to come in and do them. Yeah, go on.
I love that story. So basically, what has happened here is they are genuinely pissing on people who don't go along with the New World Order, which is absolute fire starters to right-wing people. Now, not only that, but there is another cherry on this bizarrely dystopian piece of newspeak. And here is another direct quote from the article, which is, "Once in a while, I get annoyed about the fact that I have no real privacy. Nowhere I can go and not be registered. I know that somewhere everything I do, think, and dream of is recorded. I just hope that nobody will use it against me." Like, you will fucking hope no one uses it against you? Are you serious? What the fuck? Like, I mean, seriously, I am all about a Marxist utopia that stops us from melting the ice caps and eating each other in some sort of fucked ultra-capitalist Mad Max fucking scenario. But you're not selling this well. And while you can do your own research, or you can wait for my video to find out what they actually said behind these things and all the really, substantive stuff, just for now, just feel like someone out there, probably getting paid a lot more than you are, wrote this and thought to themselves, good job.
And they did, Joel. Well, they think they did, which is exactly the same thing as far as they're concerned. Or maybe it wasn't. But we can't ponder that deep philosophical question right now because it is time to delve, fossick and shovel, knock on Rio Tinto's door and ask for some explosives and a great big bulldozer so we dig deep and find some ugly truths in our deeper dive.
Nazism, Jack. Where the hell do we start with that?
Well, let's start with one of the great myths that pervades discussion in recent times, that Nazism is from the extreme left. And so many on the right can't accept that Nazism sits somewhere in their own backyard, albeit right down the back near the fence,
Yes.
and have decided that the left should be taking responsibility for it. And of course, the left is a long way from pure. I mean, we only have to look at China and the Soviet Union, Stalin, Mao. I mean, history's greatest monsters. You throw them all in your Pol Pot, and you really got something there. So the left,
we're not perfect.
You've got yourself a stew going on. But basically, the right has come to this view based on, I've had these discussions with numerous people, so I really want to put this one to bed. The argument goes the Nazi Party or the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, has to be from the left because the word socialist sits in the party's nomenclature. So that's the way they think of it. So can we consider that Nazism is a leftist or socialist ideology or has its roots there? The first test of this is in electoral terms, and we can see over a period of time in Weimar Germany, we see election results that show us essentially and actually quite clearly under the way the Weimar Republic was collapsing, we can see it quite clearly that there's a vote shifting to the Nazi Party. In the 1927 German elections, the Nazis polled less than 1%. So that was really their first run. And
that's low.
Oh, well, it's Fraser Anning type stuff, right? I mean,
yeah, it is.
But by 1930, the Nazis had pulled 18% of the vote.
That's a strong jump.
Yes, Hitler was running around making speeches in beer halls. They were these were times of great calamity too in Germany.
Power of a good candidate too. I mean, let's face it. We just
well,
had
no,
Joe
not at
Biden
all.
make
I mean,
it.
basically, you are looking at some fairly catastrophic economic times.
Yeah,
By 1930, the Germans are going through hyperinflation, and this is all before the Great Depression really hits Europe.
yeah,
And so they got double whammied, and largely because of the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles that had basically taken a large chunk of their industrial power away,
yeah,
and required them to compensate their former enemies in World War One
yeah.
with staggering amounts of money. And so the way they dealt with that was just by printing new money,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that caused the hyperinflation.
I've seen that before.
Yes, a lot of the preconditions for World War II were established at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah,
In any event, by 1930, the Nazis had 18% of the vote, and so we can actually see where that vote came from, and because it almost exclusively came from a number of centre-right parties. So people who normally voted for centre-right parties, and we're talking about the German People's Party, the NVP, and the DVNP, which is the German National Party, German National People's Party. They lost the equivalent amount of votes that the Nazis gained. So,
like the Queensland election.
There are probably some similarities with some Queensland elections over the journey, but what we see is that percentage of vote shift from the centre right to the extreme right. As I say, very tough economic and social conditions in Germany at that time. So we are seeing the legitimisation of the extreme right, and we're seeing the centre right collapse. Now, it didn't all collapse. The Catholic Party, the German Catholic Party, remained largely intact, and that was a sort of centre-right party.
Okay.
And they continued to sort of horse trade with Hitler as Hitler's rise came about. Must be said that by the the July 1932 election, the Nazis hit their high water mark of 37% of the vote, and in the runoff in November that year, it was down to 33%. So that's basically the highest percentage of vote that they ever obtained.
It's surprising to me. I would have thought it'd be higher.
No, it's in a very disparate sort of political environment with just literally, mountains of parties, small, mainly small, and you're seeing things like the NVP and DVNP collapse under the weight of Nazism. They basically, by the time we get to 32 and the runoff that later that year, we're seeing the German People's Party splinter and fragment, and the DVNP essentially disappear. Taken over by the Nazis. At the same time, what we have going on is there's a German Communist Party. It's got its numbers too, and they're fighting on the streets with the brown shirts, particularly in Bavaria. And along comes Stalin, and through the Comintern, which he controlled, tells the German Communist Party, those people you're fighting on the street in these pitch bloody battles, they're not your enemies. The real enemies are the centre-left parties in the German political environment. So, and your mission is to destroy them. Now, the German Communist Party didn't take that entirely on board, but when the Nazis were taking the centre-right vote essentially away, what was happening was the centre-left vote was also disappearing and going towards the German Communist Party. So we see this collapse in the centre.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is leftist infighting. This feels like the kind of thing that's happening, from now until whenever.
It was a Stalin dictate, The German Communist Party were excluded, of course, from the Reichstag, and that's essentially how Hitler clambered to power. But there is nothing really in the centre. There's what's left in the centre, where 5 years before it was the bulk of had the bulk of German electoral support.
The reliable moderates.
It had essentially gone, or was just left with a skeleton. And
A vacuum.
And so, yes, this created a vacuum where the extremes on the left and the right become legitimised. And with Hitler's call for nationalism, and the virulent anti-Semitism was tolerated, and basically accepted by a great many Germans who were looking for people to blame for the woes they found themselves in. This is the sort of language that we start seeing much later on. Cabals of Jewish bankers.
Yeah,
sort of stuff that we hear discussed now. Cabals of Jewish bankers. That built up the anti-Semitism, of course, but this was a nationalist party designed to return some patriotism to Germans who'd been.
Well, I mean, at that point, they had this crisis that they want to blame on the Jews because that was a convenient patsy. Right now, we've got a crisis of a whole bunch of people really bored because they have to stay at home and eat their microwave meals without going to the pub and pestering girls at the bar. And that's when they start getting these anti-Semitic tropes into their circulation. Whereas before,
they're never very far away. I mean,
they really aren't. I feel bloody sorry for them because they just keep coming back.
Just to finish this, and so I just want people, anyone who's listening to this, to ever encounter this argument that Nazism is from the left, to be able to sit that down. These are matters of historical record. These are election results. You can actually see the centre-right German supporters shifting to the Nazi Party. But the other thing, and I've presented that argument to people, they'll turn around and say, oh, well, look, this was a socialist means of production, whatever that means. It's one of those sort of grab tags of terminology that they've picked up along the way. When we think about a Nazi economy, there's really no philosophy there. There's nothing substantial behind it other than a virulent anti-communist streak. So they would never allow the state to control the means of production. Rather, they would place the orders and the big corporations, and the corporations that weren't all that big in the 1920s started becoming very, very big indeed. The first one is Siemens. Well, I'll name a few. So most of them are around to this day. Siemens, Bavarian Motor Works, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, Krupp Engineering. They're not around anymore, and I'll explain why in a minute. But this was the rise of Nazism also gave rise to, I guess, a sort of extreme form of capitalism. But
also, Bavarian Motor Works, just for the record, is BMW.
Well, that's for the record, and for the record, BMW is a company that's never actually apologised, as the others have, for using slave labour, for using Jewish slave labour and others that have been hurled into concentration camps.
Just make a Facebook post, guys. Just say sorry. Just chuck it on Facebook. Really, Pete Evans did it.
It requires a little bit more than that, but they've never done it. And people can make their own assessments about what sort of cars they want to drive. But this is a company that's been presented with a stark view of their past and have chosen to ignore their responsibilities.
How fitting that the cops drive them these days.
I mentioned Krupp before. Krupp were basically an engineering company, and that they were the only ones dissolved post-war in a sort of Nuremberg trial phase. Krupp were the designers and manufacturers of the incinerators and gas chambers at concentration camps, and they were the only ones who were dissolved. There was a great push from the Americans to keep corporate Germany intact. And it goes a long way to explaining why Albert Speer was treated with kid gloves at Nuremberg. He was given 20 years when really he should have hanged. He knew more about the concentration camps than really anyone besides his sidekick at the time, Heydrich. And he should have hanged without doubt. But he was given 20 years. And this was really driven by pressure from the big corporations in Germany. So this idea of Nazism being a kind of version of socialism really doesn't stand up. You really have big corporations who are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, all on all on the basis of the Nazis' order, and the orders are to build up the military, build up the infrastructure as quickly as we can, because the only thing that defines Nazism in any sort of economic way is that it was a system based on, well, a form of kleptocracy,
Yeah. Okay.
a regime based on conquest, eternal conquest and theft.
Yeah.
Once you got
Stealing
there,
Europe, I suppose.
yeah. Once, I mean, it happened. It happened in Anschluss with Austria. It happened in the Sudetenland. It happened in Czechoslovakia. It happened everywhere they went. In order to keep that big wheel turning, they had to continue conquests. They had
to the victor goes the spoils, I suppose.
So it was essentially once they either negotiated their way into new lands like the Anschluss, or whether it was by conquest in France or in Poland. What they did when they got there is the first thing they do was pull up outside the reserve, outside the central banks, and just load up the trucks with gold.
Yeah.
I mean, we know all about the theft of artworks and all that sort of stuff, those sort of, Goering type affectations. But this was just theft on, on human growth hormone. This was basically once they got there, they would steal that nation's wealth.
Yeah.
And that's how they kept that machine rolling. So from the left, I'm afraid not. It was a kleptocracy run by a bunch of criminal thugs who sprang up from the right under some bizarre historical circumstances and then was followed by the right.
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. Your average Nazi is not going to vote for Greens. They're going to go more for One Nation.
Yes, they are indeed, and there's some similarities there. We couldn't actually call One Nation a Nazi party, but it does make some of the sort of noises that Nazis make, that sort of ultra-nationalism.
Dog whistles.
Oh, well, yeah, they wouldn't be the only party who whistles up a bit of racism, but they are particularly good at it. I mean, look,
it's often a good strategy, really.
Well, it's not really. It's not in any.
It's not long-term sustainable.
I mean, you can talk about realpolitik and all that sort of stuff, but it's not in a good way. It's no good for national unity. If you're promoting nationalism, you can't turn around and create an environment where national identity becomes splintered, and usually it becomes splintered on immigration.
Well, so there's the real history of Germany, and there's a lot of electoral movements there I had absolutely no idea about. Honestly, I thought Hitler just showed up, Germany dropped their pants, and it was done. But let's face it, they haven't gone away. Not yet, at least. And despite that, nobody really likes them. I mean, how have these guys kept going? I mean, come on. The swastika is poison. Nobody likes a Nazi. They just want to punch them. But, they still keep on kind of being Nazis. What the fuck?
Well, they take another form. They don't get around just like Jim Saleem and the old Australian Nazi Party. They used to get around in brown shirts with swastikas on their arms, and they were seen as a sort of oddity. It was a different time too. It was a time when a lot of Australians had lived through World War II. They were seen as this very strange thing and not tolerated so much, but despised, but allowed to sort of do their own thing. They looked to be in very small numbers, and Saleem and his mob would get out and sort of outrage people, but people, just sort of average punter walking down the street would sort of glare at them and walk out of the way.
doTERRA would allow them to sell for them.
Well, there is a huge market in Nazi memorabilia, by the way, and
there is. Yeah,
the genuine stuff, most of it was torched, and so it becomes collectible. I mean, the Soviets spent a lot of time destroying the symbols of Nazi Germany,
and all power to them.
No, indeed, they took they had a real flea in their ear about it. But today's Nazis, to the neo-Nazis of the 21st century, they don't wear the uniform. They don't self-identify. I mean, you'll see some of them. So when we look at someone like Blair Cottrell, who did identify as a Nazi and said that, basically every classroom in the country should have a copy of Mein Kampf in it for some god awful reason. That rambling, disgusting book, and so he almost sort of nailed himself there and then. And ever since then, he's been walking all this stuff back. Now he's a nationalist. Now he's a patriot. Now he's everything but a Nazi. But of course, he's still a Nazi because he was photographed and he and his group of thugs were photographed having a knees up on Hitler's birthday last year. Yeah. So it's kept a secret. You don't want to identify as a Nazi. You just want to make the same noises, the same nationalist noises. We're losing our Australian identity, whatever that was. And, we are losing our racial identity. So they will speak in that sort of Nazi code. They also use a lot of symbols that aren't necessarily immediately identifiable to people. So they use codes and dates, etc. So 88 is a key number for your average Nazi. 8 being the eighth
letter of the alphabet
is an H, Heil Hitler 88.
Yeah.
And indeed, there's a French group of Nazis called the 88 Squadron in Sydney.
Charming.
They are lovely. They are lovely. But here's the thing about them. They will form briefly. And we've seen this in this country. We've seen, the Australian Nazi Party sort of eventually died, but this new group that really has its roots in the Australian League of Rights, going back sort of immediate post-war, and sort of a vicious anti-Semitic pro-nationalist group, they devolve. They'll ratchet up a new name for a political party. So we have the United Patriots Front, which Cottrell was involved in and then walked away from.
Of course.
This is the other thing about them. So there's Reclaim Australia. And as soon as they're established, they start splintering. This is the other thing about the hard right in this country, and probably keeps the risk of them down fairly low, or minimises it to some extent, is that they're seemingly incapable of political organisation.
Is this a pissing contest for power? Everyone wants to be at the top,
well, they keep on. They're too stupid. They're often too stupid to politically organise properly.
What, racist? Stupid?
Mate. And as soon as they see, Cottrell probably perceives himself as this sort of charismatic figure, and then he looks at someone like Ericsson and goes, "Oh, he's trying to be a charismatic figure like me. We're going to splinter the party. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to start a new one." But
and his fucking toll sweatshirts, Jesus Christ.
But and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, Ericsson, I would not consider to be a charismatic figure. He's a complete and utter mug. But they do assemble, collectively, and we've seen that in recent times. There was an assembly, in fact, that was attended by Senator Fraser Anning, who spoke briefly and got the old Heil Hitler salutes for his trouble, denied being a Nazi, but he certainly had a lot of Nazis around him, put it that way.
You can dance as much as you like, but if fuckwits like you, you're probably a fuckwit.
Yeah, exactly right. So, the company you keep is a very good answer to all of this, because they don't self-identify anymore. They don't. They keep the swastikas in the shed.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw that Milo Yiannopoulos, who probably doesn't believe in Nazism, but this sort of weird guy who
they would have had him up against the wall. Let's face it.
Well, yeah, indeed. Given his sexuality, but he was happy enough to cling on to it and befriend a lot of people from the various Nazi organisations in the United States and some in Europe too.
He cuddled around with Nazis, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's right. There's footage of him singing "God Bless America" in a Texas bar to a bunch of clowns who are giving him the whole Hitler stuff.
Really?
Yeah,
Fuck.
and he
That's not good.
well. His explanation or excuse for this was saying he wasn't wearing his glasses, so he couldn't. They were literally 3 meters away, and there were at least a cricket team of guys giving him the Nazi salute. So he said he wasn't wearing his glasses, so he's terribly, terribly myopic without them. And
what a mea culpa that is. Fuck
yeah,
me.
I know.
Pete Evans needs to get him on board right now and say, mate, you need to dig me out of this hole I've fucking dug myself into. Did I forget my glasses?
Yeah, indeed. But at the same time, Yiannopoulos has got all his form, right? He's actually run out of audience in the United States. This
well,
is
yeah, they thought he was a pedo, so...
Well, that's right, because he had said some rather odd things about a Catholic priest that was a friend of his when he was a young man, very young man, in fact, a teenager, and it was...
It was on the nose.
Yeah, it was, and it was, it was basically saying that...
Lost him a book deal, basically got him cancelled.
Yeah, book deal cancelled, everyone walked away, except for Australia, where he decided he was going to do a national tour and came over here and was photographed with, the usual suspects on the right, claiming some sort of nonsense about free speech and, he sort of does all this sort of performative condemnation of the left and all this sort of stuff. And that was enough for them. So they would embrace, I should say, they would embrace someone who had at least himself embraced Nazi tropes, and that was okay for them. The really bizarre thing about this, of course, and this, we don't have to think too much about how ridiculous Nazism is in Australia, because when we think about what happened in World War II, the second AIF battled the Nazis, the Desert Corps, Rommel's Desert Corps in North Africa. Australian lives were lost to Nazi soldiers.
Absolutely.
And that should never, ever be forgotten. And, of course, Australian airmen who were working for the RAF over Europe were also killed in significant number. So these guys were our enemies, but
absolutely,
this sort of nonsense is still, it's just like...
And it's not
almost
Germany,
the line gets...
It's Nazis.
That's right. It's almost the line gets moved a little bit every year to what can be tolerated.
Basically, the one thing that the last week has taught us with the downfall of Pete Evans, the spectacular downfall of Pete Evans, is you can be as racist, anti-Semitic, and generally as awful as you like. But once you're actually a Nazi, once you've got that branding of a Nazi, that PR problem of being a Nazi, all bets are off. You basically, you get excommunicated from the community, you're out, you're done. Same shit, but you're official.
No, there are certain
exceptions to the rule.
There are a number of exceptions to that rule. I mean, Blair Cottrell, who is just for people who don't know who Blair Cottrell is. He's a convicted criminal. He's been convicted of arson. He's been convicted of stalking. He's been convicted of supply anabolic steroids, and using, I'm sure. And I think users may have used them on occasions. Yes,
he's a big boy.
He's a large human being. But now he was interviewed by former NT Chief Minister Adam Giles on Sky News. Look, I'm not saying Blair Cottrell shouldn't be interviewed. He should be interviewed, but he should be raked over the coals, because the further you dive into him, the more he's going to cough up. But instead, Adam Giles referred to Blair Cottrell as mate throughout the interview.
As a chum,
as a buddy. Yeah, so that was pretty awful. And of course, we had a senator, a senator, Fraser Anning, one nation nominee who fell ass backwards into the Senate. Who dropped the fond tag? About the moment he walked into the door, and just went on to become, certainly he attended a rally at St Kilda Beach in Melbourne,
He blamed the Christchurch shooting on the Muslims.
Yes, he did indeed. He
was fucking disgusting.
He makes all the sounds. I believe he's holed up somewhere in the United States.
Is he really?
I think his creditors are still sniffing around, shall we say. One of the problems that thought it might exclude him from the Senate, but was sort of only delayed. But there he was in secured a beat, copying the old Zig Heil stuff from Cottrell and his mates.
Yeah.
And, of course, Cottrell was interviewed on that day by a Channel 7 reporter who, the super underneath Blair Cottrell's large noggin was vigilante. He wasn't described as a Nazi. He wasn't described as a man who'd suggested that Mein Kampf should be in every classroom. And a guy who's been sniffing around the extreme right of Australian politics for a very long time.
And a network that should know better than to not know him on the radar, realistically. I mean, come on, guys.
Well, it would be... I cannot imagine how it was not known who he was.
Yeah, and even the intern would know.
And I think they tried to legitimise who he was by describing him as a vigilante. This is what I'm talking about, where the line shifts. And, we saw Pete Evans, who may not be anti-Semitic, but certainly has made some pretty awful sounds on anti-vaccinations and 5G technologies and the pandemic.
Yeah.
Once he posted
the Sonorad.
The Sonorad in cartoon form. Basically he was cut off.
And there's other things that back that up, but it was the Sonorad that sunk him. There's the Holocaust denial hints that have come up in a few of those posts that have been screenshotted and circulated around, but they're hints. They're not definitive.
I guess Blair Cottrell, doesn't sell cookbooks, but.
Yeah,
and that's why sort of Pete had sort of what we might call traditional commercial partners who were prepared to tolerate him to a point because they're still making some coin out of it. Now, Cottrell doesn't do cooking shows. It'd be that would be very funny. Look, I mean, when we think about it, Evans was due to be on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here until that Nazi business, the Son and Rad cartoon was published, and before that, Chappelle Corby, convicted drug smuggler, she turned up on Channel 7's SAS Australia.
But let's face it,
maybe Blair Cottrell, maybe someone's sniffing around Blair Cottrell, thinking, we might pick up a bit of negative PR, get a nice old negative PR hit from putting Blair Cottrell on. I don't know what's that. What's that?
SAS, buddy, whatever.
Ninja show, maybe.
Ninja something, Ninja Warrior. Yeah,
maybe you could do that. I mean, but
he'd be good at it. Let's face it.
The idea that once you self-identify as a Nazi, or once you are seen to be so in the thick of things that you can't be perceived any other way, a lot of society's going to turn off you, but a lot of media is going to turn on you.
You're a hot topic at that point.
That's right. It's a small man making a big noise.
Yeah, and it's tricky.
That's often what happens. And because they don't, have little mustaches and weird little glasses and have German Shepherds on leashes.
No obvious tidges,
And they make all the sort of normal or the sort of tropes that will get them some traction with people just listening on. Oh, there are far too many Asians here. Oh, look at all these Muslims causing problems around the world. Wouldn't it just be
Which
better?
is commercially bloody acceptable as long as there's no swastika involved.
That's right. So
insane.
That's why people like Cottrell have taken the swastikas away, because they're able to enlarge their audience by making those sort of calls for nationalism, anti-immigration stances.
That's it. And this is the reason why, if you can do all you like, but I tell you what, once you slap that sonorane on there, you are fucked.
Well, yeah, but, you
can come back from it.
You can still turn up on Channel 7 News.
Well, I tell you what, you can turn up on Parler. That's a conversation we'll have in the week in Pete Evans.
Yes, indeed. That's making plenty of noise at the moment.
So as far as like actual Nazi parties in Australia, Jim Salim, that's all I really know. There's your fringe nutcase like your Blair Cottrells and your Neil Ericksons, but Jim Salim's apparently the Nazi Party guy.
Well, he's been their ideologue for a long time. And look, Salim, there's no Australian Nazi Party per se now. And there was, but there isn't now. And that's because it was deregistered long ago.
Yeah, makes sense.
Look, Salim ran as an independent in a Queensland by-election, a federal by-election in Queensland 2 years ago, and seemed to slip under the radar a fair bit. Only polled, less than 1,000 votes, well under 1,000 votes. But Salim is kind of, he's part of the history of extreme right-wing politics in Australia that really had its roots in the Australian League of Rights, a group essentially from Queensland based on anti-Semitism, based on anti-immigration.
When was this around? Just circa?
This is almost immediate post-war. So
wow,
the immediate post-war years, for the next 5 to 10, it must be said, a terrible time to be a Nazi. But really by the late 50s, those sort of Nazi ideals had started to rear their head around the world, of course, and in Australia too, through the Australian League of Rights, which was an anti-Semitic, anti-immigration group. As with all extreme right-wing political parties, they tend to splinter. And the Australian League of Rights really wasn't a political organisation. It was more, well, it was a political organisation, but it didn't run candidates under that name in elections. So what we have then is groups like Salim's establishing, shocking people, and shocking people for good reason. I mean, we were fighting against the Nazis in North Africa. Our airmen were fighting against the Nazis over Europe with the RAF.
And now they're coming back and showing their pants in public, and you're thinking, mate, just fuck off.
Yeah, and that's the Salim age, and Salim had a bloke hang around him. He was always in the brown shirt and swastika. I can't think of his name, but he did have the nickname Skull, and it was because he suffered this terrible, genetic disorder, which gave him a sort of almost like a pinhead type quality.
Oh, really?
And it was just the oddest thing to hear Salim talking about, the chosen race and all this sort of stuff.
Eugenics in action.
Well, he's got a bit of a throwback standing alongside him. Anyway, we won't dwell on his particular disability, but that was the nature of things. And since then, we've had this: we're Nazis, but we're not Nazis. We're not outwardly Nazis.
Yeah,
and we will create we will create sort of fringe political parties, and some that loom reasonably large. But this is the problem they have: they continue to splinter, dissent, fight, squabble, and then start all over again with a new party. It's a wonder they haven't run out of political party names that featured the words patriot or reclaim or alliance.
There's a lot of mixes you can make, mate. There's a lot of wordplay in those patriot circles.
Look, I don't know that they're fooling too many people, because every time there's a rally, whether it's the True Blue crew, who aren't politically represented, but they're just nuisances who get along and complain.
Effective nuisances, though. Well, they turn up. They turn up.
I mean, the cameras. The problem with them is the cameras hit on them. These are heavily tattooed gentlemen who don't look very nice company to be with. They're not the sort of blokes you'd like to stand in a bar with and have a beer. So when they do sort of turn up, driven by their miserable ideologies and their ill-considered ideologies, they tend to be considered as sort of fringe groups. But taken once you take these little fringe groups there, fringe group there, fringe group there, fringe group there, and given this great anomaly of why on earth would you have a Nazi party in Australia after we fought against them in World War II? Why do we have them at all? I mean, what is going on there? And what is going on there is this sort of tap on the shoulder of xenophobic Australia.
Yeah, and look, it still exists. It's absolutely wild, and let's face it, it doesn't feel like it's going anywhere. But I think we're at this point with the Pete Evans, the cancellation, the whole thing.
We're on the brink of something. Yeah, look, all I know is if you're a Blair Cottrell or a Jim Saleem or a Neil Erickson, you'd have a pretty big ASIO file. I mean, ASIO certainly regard, and our security agencies generally regard extreme right-wing, ultra-nationalist groups. They might not call them Nazis, but they are. They regard them as a serious threat, and we saw that those threats, at least planned and targets identified by the extreme right terrorist Phillip Galea. You know, his intention was to blow up buildings, cause mayhem.
Yep.
And that's, he's just been put away for it. Don't tell me.
But his mates stopped him in.
Don't tell me these threats don't exist. Don't tell me they're just, yes, they're fringe dwellers, but the threats they pose are significant.
Well, yeah, some of these guys have nothing to lose, let's face it.
Indeed, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think...
Or they want to make a name for themselves. That's the other thing.
Yeah, 100%. And look, let's face it, it's the first and last thing they'll do in the history of themselves. Like they're nobody outside of the fact that maybe they did something horrifically damaging. They'll get a Wikipedia article they would never have had before.
Yes, indeed. And it leads us on to our next segment, Joel. Very, 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 very comfortable little segue there, because we're going to have to take another look at Eric Trump. In our segment, Like a Bastard on Father's Day. Eric is, he's a bit of a fringe dweller himself, and I think
it's been a big week in Eric Trump.
Oh, well, look, every week's a big week for Eric. I mean, his endless problems just continue to roll along.
They're only going to get worse. Oh, bless him. Oh, God, I'm glad I'm not paying his therapy bills, the poor bastard.
They're going to get bigger, Joel. They're going to get a lot bigger.
Exponential.
While the Donald is basically just sitting in the Oval Office, shitting his pants and yelling at people, including Eric.
Yes.
Basically, it's been left to the media to wonder who will be the next Donald Trump. Yeah. Now, it may well be that the next Donald Trump is, in fact, Donald Trump Senior, and that he has a lash in 2024 and announces his candidacy fairly early. But let's say he's not. Let's say Donnie says, reaches for the putter and says, "Look, I've had enough. I'm going to go and play a lot of golf at Mar-a-Lago," and off he wanders. So the media's been sort of wondering about these things, and they get to Donald Trump Jr. and they get to Ivanka, and then they get to Eric and go, "Oh, not Eric." Ooh, so they've actually suggested his wife might be a presidential candidate, but not Eric. Not Eric.
No, not our Eric.
Completely overlooked.
Love you, Dad.
I love you, Dad. But Dad's playing golf and
forgot your name, so you could just fuck off.
The Trump organisation has just filed for bankruptcy, and Eric, your wife looks like a better presidential candidate than you do.
If anything, Eric looks like a good scapegoat for a series of charges that could ambiguously be placed upon him. Look, Eric, you've got to do 25 years for Dad, but he loves you. Oh, what? He loves me?
Dad does love you. But
I'll go down.
Well, you do the money laundering time.
Who's my lawyer? Oh, Rudy Giuliani. I trust him implicitly. Tell me more about where it's happening.
Look, it's just a wonderful thing, that of the entire Trump family, and it's only a matter of time before the media start looking at Barron and go, he could be a candidate too, but not Eric. His wife Lara, sure. Donnie Jr., could be. Ivanka, yeah, certainly. She's got some Republican Party kudos going on there. Eric. No. But he's a good-looking boy, though.
He's a good-looking boy.
He is a good-looking boy.
I tell you what, if I was the Trump administration, I'll be making sure that Barron Trump's laptop is being kept under very close guard, because you never know what's going on these days. These fucking kids with TikTok and whatnot.
Yeah.
I tell you what,
Barron could be the 53rd president of the United States.
Or he could be the Hunter Biden of the administration. Let's find out.
Yeah. Well, let's get a look at his laptop and get maybe Rudy Giuliani just to sweat on him.
Yes.
Just a sweat and just release. He looked like, someone had stuffed up Hercule Poirot's makeup. Didn't Rudy? It's just unbelievable stuff. This guy's on $20,000 a day, and he belongs in an asylum.
There's no justice in the world, because I would do a lot of very fucked up things for $20,000 a day, and yet this asshole, all he has to do is reel out some basic Q tropes, sweat out some fucking hair dye, and he just gets to hang out in his bloody spa bath, wherever the fuck it is. America's favorite mayor, I'm just going to say on record, can go fuck himself at this point.
Look, perhaps there's a segment there, but we can't ignore... We can't ignore Eric because this segment's named after him, but we can't ignore Eric, who is the one person in the family not considered presidential candidate material.
No. And that is, let's face it, that is the role of a bastard on Father's Day.
He's a good-looking boy, though.
He's a good-looking boy. He's got that going for him. If you're into that kind of thing, he's a good-looking boy.
Just looked like he walked off the set of a Scotch ad.
Yeah, just right off a yacht. Oh, good Lord.
I love him. And now it's time for this. And I know a lot of people have been waiting just for this particular segment. It's the week in Pete Evans. And hasn't it been a huge week? I mean, normally any week is a huge week for Pete, but this is off the charts. This has gone bananas. I mean, the man can't be sleeping. He must have sleep deprivation, psychosis. He's got invisible spiders crawling over his face. It's been so busy for him this week. And just as we went to air, we just checked and look, Pete's popped up and said he's walking out. He's walking out of Facebook. He's leaving Facebook. And he's jumping before he's pushed, I suppose. And in traditional Pete Evans style, his departure, notice, is full of shameless self-promotion. He's off to Parler. Tell me what Parler is, Joel.
It's affectionately known as Fashbook because it's a free speech platform, which is ironically a place of misinformation that a lot of misinformation peddlers have freaked out about the fact that misinformation is peddled about them. I love Parler. It fucking sucks. It's a cesspool. Watch it implode. But Pete's put his money behind it, and that's where he's at.
Do you think that Pete will be able to bounce back on Parler and tell us what he really thinks about German history?
Mate, he's uncensored. He's off the chain now.
He's off the leash.
He's off the leash. There's no more Baccarat to hold him back. There's no more Solomon Lou's house. And let's face it, he's absolutely unchained now. He doesn't have to worry about the fact that he is in the sphere. He's out now. And he
can't upset anybody anymore. He can't upset anybody who owes him a quid anymore. It's all done there. So he is basically unrestrained, unfettered, unhindered.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is not the last we're going to see of Pete, because this sort of thing, this happening as we spoke, as we were going through it. But the thing is great.
It's a major shift from Pete.
He's going to go full fash. He's going to go hardcore.
I feel it too. I feel that this is not the end of the Week in Pete Evans segment. I think
the start.
This is the start of something really big with the Week in Pete Evans. He's going to have a huge, huge week, pretty much every week.
And every time he bans me, I'm going to make another alt account. So don't you worry, Petey. I've got you covered, baby.
You got him covered. So the thing that I find terrifying in all of this is how his supporters have come to his side, Joe.
Yeah. I mean, obviously his Instagram and his Facebook are highly curated. I mean, I got muted by Pete because I'm probably drinking at the time. I accidentally replied on his wall when I thought it was another page on the bitch about Pete Evans pages that I'm like all subscribed to. But seriously, it seems like the wellness community might be full of Nazis. And
Nazi sympathisers, at least. I think we could say that some people who might be turned to Nazism at a pinch.
Well, potentially, because they're very vague. But the thing is they say things like he's speaking his truth and freedom of speech is important. And that shit, to me, you leave that shit at the door. And as we spoke before, Nazis have a PR problem. Look, you can do all the anti-Semitic Q tropes that you want in the world. But when it comes to Nazis, if you're really going to tacitly approve that stuff, that's crazy. The wellness community, they are lining up to back him.
Yeah, I can see how that happens. And look, he might be sort of a little bit short of ability to write, but he just gets that message out there. He can't really elucidate what freedom of speech means. I mean, basically he's saying is, I'm Pete Evans and I'd like to say whatever I want to say.
That's right, with no consequences whatsoever, because that's how freedom of speech works. I mean, like, Philosophy 101, mate. Come on, please, do a correspondence course.
Yeah, because it doesn't really work that way at all. We have defamation laws. We have all sorts of restraints on free speech that Pete Evans should know everything about.
As I've said before, I mean, let's face it, when it comes to anti-vax community, the kind of people who generally pal around with Pete Evans, there's an arts degree between the lot of them. I mean, it's not an educated group of people. And realistically, it's looking like these people are either walking examples of cognitive dissonance, which are unable to reconcile the fact that Pete Evans might be a piece of shit, and therefore they're happy to say that neo-Nazis are okay before saying that Pete Evans is a bad person, or they're all just complete morons and the entire thing is just a stew of stupidity. But my bet is on the cognitive dissonance.
Where do you think it's going to go? Where do you think it's going to go?
I reckon what's going to happen here is that Pete Evans is going to rise like one of those fruity Nazi bats they had on those bloody giant flags, and he's going to become a sketchy...
Eagles. They're eagles. They're eagles.
I reckon he's going full fash. The bat was a joke. And he's going to have a cult that's just going to hang off every word. And let's face it, the guy's mate to David Icke, who is a well-known Holocaust denier.
Oh, yeah.
Max Egan, all these fascist fucks. And this time, he has no backer holding him back, no house holding him back, no Coles holding him back. He has a cult of people that hang off his every word, and he no longer has to hide the fact that he may very well think the Jewish bankers tricked us on the Holocaust. And you know what? Maybe Pete Evans is going to become one of the most effective neo-Nazi recruiters in Australian modern history, basically like getting a down channel on doTERRA.
You make Jim Salim look like a rank amateur.
And
look, that's terrific, Joel. And we'll be keeping a very close eye on that over the coming weeks, and we look forward to many more segments of the Week in Pete Evans.
So many.
You have been listening to the Conditional Release program with your hosts, Jack the Insider and Joel Hill. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, and if you've enjoyed our bullshit, throw us a 5-star review on your podcast app.
Jack can be found on Twitter on @JackTheInsider and Joel at @CrunchyMoses with a K. We've set up a Facebook page which you can find if you search for the Conditional Release program.
And finally, all feedback, tips and death threats should be sent to the Conditional Release program @gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, even if it's simply to tell us all about the real history of Germany.
Thanks,
listeners. Catch you next
week. See you guys.
Bye.